Mom, please go to the back table with the service staff. Only important people go up front here, my daughter told me under the gaze of a few guests. My name is Eleanor. I am 72 years old, and my whole life I was taught that silence was golden. What my daughter didn't know is that I was the absolute owner of the event hall she was standing in. The sound of the string quartet seemed to vanish into the air, drowned out by the echo of her words. Chloe looked at me with that impatience I had known since she was a little girl, with narrowed eyes and a tense jaw, waiting for me to lower my head and obey without making a sound. She was wearing an emerald silk dress that made it hard for her to breathe, and a half-finished glass of champagne in her right hand. Around us, the grand hall of the Ashwood estate was buzzing with activity. Waiters in impeccable black vests and white gloves glided between the round tables, which were covered in imported linen tablecloths. The air smelled of fresh orchids and roasted duck, a combination that had always turned my stomach a little, but which, for my daughter, represented the absolute pinnacle of social success. I didn't cry. My eyes didn't fill with tears, nor did I feel that lump in the throat they always talk about in novels. I am not the type of woman who cries when she is humiliated. I am the type who observes, memorizes, and keeps score. I nodded slowly with an almost imperceptible movement of my head and turned around. The walk from the center of the dance floor to the back of the hall felt endless, not out of shame, but because of the crushing clarity with which I began to see my entire life. Every step on the polished marble floor echoed in my low-heeled shoes. I passed the head table where my son-in-law Richard was laughing loudly at a tasteless joke the city's mayor had just told. Richard had that habit, laughing with his mouth wide open when he was near someone with political or economic power, and pressing his lips together in disdain when he spoke to the employees. Today, he and Chloe had turned my great-grandson's baptism into a public relations event to cover up the cracks in his construction company. I passed table number 2, where Richard's new investors were seated, men in gray suits who looked at their phones more than at the baby being celebrated. I passed table 3, where my grandson David was trying to calm little Leo, while his wife Sarah shot me a look of apology and confusion as she saw me walking toward the back. Poor Sarah. Chloe had treated her like a glorified incubator from the very day she found out about the pregnancy. I reached the small round table located almost against the swinging kitchen doors. It didn't have an orchid centerpiece, just a solitary salt shaker and some paper napkins that contrasted crudely with the fabric on the other tables. This was where the photographers, the musicians on their break, and the coordination staff left their coats and sneaked sips of water. I sat down on a folding metal chair that creaked under my weight. The light here was different, less warm, contaminated by the fluorescent glare that escaped every time a waiter pushed the kitchen door open. The constant noise of plates, clashing silverware dropping into plastic bins, and orders being shouted over a low flame formed an impenetrable barrier that separated me from the luxury up front. I placed my black purse on my knees and smoothed the skirt of my gray dress. It was a dress I had tailored myself, stitch by stitch, because I always preferred the quality of my own hands over the pretentious labels Chloe begged me to buy. As I watched the waiters coming and going, the exhaustion of the last 3 weeks dropped onto my shoulders like a block of cement. Leo's baptism hadn't organized itself. Chloe had hired a wildly expensive event planner, yes, but the planner didn't comfort a colicky baby at 3 in the morning. I had temporarily moved into David and Sarah's house to help them through the first few months. Sarah was exhausted, recovering from a complicated C-section, and David was working 14-hour days at the law firm to pay the mortgage that his own father, Richard, had convinced him to take on. For 21 days, I washed bottles, ironed tiny clothes, prepared nutritious broths for Sarah, and rocked Leo in the dim light of dawn while the rest of the world slept. Chloe, on the other hand, showed up twice a week at 11 in the morning with dark sunglasses and shopping bags from exclusive children's boutiques. She would take the baby out of the crib, dress him in sailor suits that irritated his skin, take 400 photos with her phone, upload them to her social media, and then hand him back to me, crying because she had to get to her manicure appointment. "Oh, Mom, you have so much more patience for tantrums," she would say before vanishing, leaving behind a trail of sickeningly sweet perfume and dirty bottles. And then there was the baptism gown. Chloe had insisted that Leo wear a French antique she saw in a magazine, but when she saw the price tag, she suddenly decided that family tradition was more important. She brought me a dusty cardboard box containing the gown David had worn almost 30 years ago. It was yellowed, the lace was frayed, and it was missing 3 buttons on the back. "Fix it, Mom. You have those magic hands," she ordered, dropping the box on my sewing table without even asking if I had the time or the energy. For 4 nights straight, I sat under the light of my sewing lamp, unstitching the ruined lace with surgical care, hand-washing the fabric with mild soap and baking soda to restore its whiteness, and sewing on a new bobbin lace that I had bought myself using my pension money. I replaced the missing buttons with 3 small mother-of-pearl beads I cut from an old necklace my mother had given me. When I handed the finished gown to Chloe this very morning at the church, she didn't even look at it closely. She snatched it from my hands and gave it to the nanny she had hired just for today to carry the baby while she greeted the important guests. Chloe's blindness to the effort of others was nothing new. She had always been like that, ever since she was a teenager. My late husband, Arthur, used to say we had spoiled our only daughter too much to make up for the hardships we faced when we were young. Arthur and I were not born into silk cradles. When we got married at 20, our only asset was a 2-burner stove and a fierce desire not to starve to death. We started out selling lunches to construction workers in the industrial zone. I would cook starting at 4 in the morning, and he would deliver the food on a rusted bicycle. Little by little, we bought a food cart. Then we rented a storefront. Then we founded an industrial catering company. And finally, we made the leap into the luxury event business. Arthur was a man with rough hands and a genuine smile. He was never ashamed of smelling like onions and bleach. We worked side by side for 45 years. We didn't have free weekends or vacations abroad or expensive hobbies. Every dollar we earned, we reinvested in the future. Over time, Arthur proved to have a clinical eye for real estate. When the city started expanding south, he bought vacant lots that nobody wanted. He said the city would grow, and the rich would look for spacious places for their weddings and parties. He was right. One of those lots was an old, ruined estate surrounded by century-old trees. It took us 5 years to restore it. Arthur oversaw the masonry, salvaged the original wooden beams, and planted dozens of new ash trees. I designed the industrial kitchen, the service flow, the layout of the halls. It was our masterpiece. We called it the Ashwood Estate. When we finished, we decided not to operate it ourselves. We were already tired, and Arthur's knees were starting to fail. We created a corporation, Oakmont Holdings, and leased the property to a prestigious event management firm on a 20-year contract. They provided the brand name, the staff, and the clients. We collected a juicy percentage of every event and maintained absolute ownership of the land and the facilities. Chloe never understood the magnitude of our business. To her, we were just the catering people. When she married Richard, a recently graduated architect with a heavy last name and very little money, she was embarrassed that her parents had to work on Saturday nights. Arthur bought her her first house, paid for David's college tuition, and saved Richard from bankruptcy at least 3 times. But Chloe always framed those financial rescues as her husband's smart investments. When Arthur passed away 7 years ago from a massive heart attack that tore away half my soul, Chloe just assumed I would liquidate everything and hand out the inheritance. Instead, I made it clear that I was keeping control of Oakmont Holdings. I gave her a generous monthly allowance, but the main assets stayed in my name. Chloe never knew exactly which properties were part of the company. She never asked. To her, business was boring and in poor taste. She only cared that the wire transfer hit her account on the 5th of every month. So when the event planner offered to rent the Ashwood estate for the baptism, bragging that it was the most exclusive and hardest-to-book venue in the region, Chloe accepted immediately to impress Richard's friends. She had no idea that legally she was renting my own house. And there I was, the owner of every wooden beam, every square foot of marble, and every oven in the kitchen, sitting at the back table with the service staff. A young boy in a waiter's uniform pushed through the swinging door carrying an empty tray. He stopped at my table, sighed heavily, and rubbed the back of his neck. He looked at me in surprise, probably wondering what an old woman in a gray dress was doing sitting in his break area. I offered him a short, tight smile, the kind of smile that doesn't demand conversation. He returned a shy gesture and hurried back into the kitchen upon hearing the harsh shout of the floor manager. From my position, I had a perfect view of the entire hall. It felt like a stage play where I was the only audience member who knew the ending. I saw Richard sweating inside his suit, leaning toward the mayor with a sickening subservience. I saw Chloe parading from table to table, touching the shoulders of the politicians' wives, showing off her grandson's gown without ever mentioning who had sewn the buttons. The morning had started poorly, right from the church. I arrived early in a taxi because Richard said the family car was full of floral arrangements. I sat in the second row, leaving the first one free for the parents and grandparents as protocol dictates. But when Chloe arrived, she brought the mayor's wife and the lead investor's wife with her. Without even looking me in the eye, she made a rushed gesture with her hand for me to move to the third row, whispering that she needed the honorary godmothers up front for the photographs. I stood up in silence and gave up my seat. Throughout the entire Mass, I stared at my daughter's back. I noticed how she touched up her lipstick using the front-facing camera on her phone, while the priest poured holy water over Leo's head. I felt a deep sting in my chest. Not of sadness, but of a disappointment so old it barely even hurt anymore. It just weighed me down with the force of a stone at the bottom of a lake. When the ceremony ended, I went straight to the reception. The taxi driver dropped me off in front of the estate's imposing wrought iron gates. The security guard at the entrance asked for my ID in a rough tone. I didn't blame him. He worked for the management agency and didn't know my face since my dealings were always directly with the firm's directors at the central office. I simply showed him my invitation card and walked in along the crunching gravel path. As I crossed the gardens, I paused for a moment in front of the largest oak tree, the one Arthur and I had saved from a termite infestation 15 years ago. I ran my hand over the rough bark and felt a brutal connection to the earth beneath my feet. This was my history. This place was my husband's sweat and my sleepless early mornings. And now it was decorated with white fabrics and twinkling lights to celebrate the vanity of a daughter who respected neither of those things. When I walked into the main hall, I looked for my name on the elegant, clear acrylic board where the guest list was displayed. I checked table 1. It wasn't there. I checked table 2, reserved for immediate family. Not there. I scanned tables 3 and 4. Nothing. For a second, I thought it had been a printing error from the expensive print shop Chloe had hired. I walked over to the head table, where Chloe was scolding a waiter because the air conditioning was too low for her liking. I stood beside her, waiting patiently for her to finish humiliating the boy who just nodded with his head down. When she finally turned around, her face flashed a fleeting expression of annoyance at seeing me standing there, claiming a space in her perfectly choreographed world. I asked her in a low voice, so as not to embarrass her in front of the others, where I was supposed to sit, since my name wasn't on the entrance board. That was when she delivered the line. She grabbed me by the elbow, with that firm, fake grip of someone feigning affection while holding a dagger. And she pulled me a few steps away toward the side aisle, out of earshot of her wealthy friends. Her perfume invaded my nostrils, strong, sweet, and artificial. "Mom, please go to the back table with the service staff. Only important people go up front here," she said. The words came out of her mouth with a terrifying naturalness, as if she were asking me to pass the salt. Richard is about to close a $1 million contract with the mayor and his partners. We need the front tables to project a corporate image. You can't be up there with your gray dress and your stories about selling food on the street. You don't fit in. Be reasonable. Go to the back. I'll have them send you a plate of whatever we're having. She let go of my elbow, and without waiting for a reply, turned around to greet a local politician with a radiant smile, as if a switch had just been flipped on her face. I stood there for about 10 seconds. There were no screams of outrage in my head. I do not operate on hysteria. My mind, molded by decades of balancing ledgers and dealing with suppliers, simply registered the event as a hard, irrefutable fact. My daughter considered me a social nuisance at a celebration of my own blood. She saw me as the family's old maid, useful for sewing old clothes and changing diapers in the middle of the night, but unworthy of breaking bread in public. That asymmetry hit me with the precision of a sharpened scalpel. I had given her everything: I had built an empire in the shadows for her so she could walk in the sun without burning her feet. And her response, her gratitude, was to send me to the dark corner next to the kitchen, hiding the poverty of her origins so as not to scare off the sharks her husband was trying to swim with in an ocean that didn't belong to them. I snapped back to the present at the back table. The clatter of plates anchored me back in immediate reality. I watched one of the older waitresses, a woman my age with her hair pulled back in a tight bun, lean against the kitchen doorframe. She discreetly slipped off a black shoe to relieve the pain of a bunion deforming her foot. She recognized me with the tired look of someone who has been standing for hours, serving people who don't even say thank you when handed a full plate. In that instant, I knew exactly which side of the room my true people were on. I was far more like that exhausted waitress than the woman dressed in emerald silk who shared my blood. Chloe had made a fatal miscalculation. She thought my silence was submission. She thought my gray dress was a sign of weakness. She thought that because I was her mother, I would swallow the humiliation quietly to protect the family peace and keep up appearances. But the family peace had been shattered the moment she decided my dignity was worth less than her husband's construction contract. A waiter rushed by with a pitcher of ice water and slightly bumped into the leg of my folding chair. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," he muttered, terrified, expecting the severe scolding he was surely used to getting at these kinds of parties. "Don't worry about it, son," I replied with a firm, serene voice. He looked at me with relief and kept walking toward the bar. My gaze crossed the massive hall and locked onto the head table again. The first course was being served to the VIP guests, a delicate avocado and lobster timbale garnished with edible flowers. I saw Chloe raise her champagne glass and tap the crystal with a silver spoon to get the room's attention. The entire hall gradually quieted down, lowering the volume of their trivial conversations. Richard stood up, adjusting his silk tie, ready to give a speech about family, divine blessings, and undoubtedly the city's brilliant economic future. A not-so-subtle wink to the mayor, who smiled with satisfaction to his right. Everyone was watching them. Everyone believed in the illusion of prosperity and lineage they were projecting under the crystal chandeliers. Everyone, except me. I opened my black purse slowly. My fingers brushed past my cell phone, the pack of tissues, and the small plastic case holding my blood pressure pills. I didn't need any of that right now. What I needed was cold air and absolute perspective. I took a deep breath, feeling the oxygen fill my lungs and straighten my back instantly, stripping away the exhaustion of the last 3 weeks. I wasn't going to make a scene from my folding chair. I wasn't going to shout demands or cry like a victim in front of 200 guests who didn't even know my name. That would be playing their game, stepping perfectly into the role of the bitter, hysterical old woman that Chloe would later use to justify having hidden me from her friends. No, my justice wasn't going to be a fleeting emotional tantrum. It was going to be cold, surgical, and irreversibly devastating. Arthur had taught me during the long years of building the company that true power never needs to raise its voice. It only needs to be exercised with precision at the right time and place. Slowly, I stood up. The metal chair creaked again under my weight, a harsh industrial sound that got lost beneath the initial applause for the speech Richard was beginning to deliver. I grabbed my black purse by its leather handles and hung it firmly over my right forearm. I left my gray wool coat folded over the back of the folding chair, a mute physical sign that I had been there, that I had occupied the unworthy place they assigned me for a few minutes. I didn't look toward the head table. I didn't seek Chloe's gaze to see if she noticed my absence, nor David's. I had seen enough falsehood for one afternoon. I spun on my heels, turning my back permanently on the artificial luxury, the imported flowers that nauseated me, and the plastic smiles of the important people. I took my first step away from the table, walking through the small, bustling staff break area. I passed right in front of the heavy, swinging kitchen doors at the exact moment they burst open for a service cart. The thick smell of burnt butter, meat broth, and spices hit my face, a familiar smell that reminded me where I came from. Inside the kitchen, the chaos was at its peak, with cooks in white coats shouting cross orders, and the head chef frantically checking the main courses before they went out to the floor. I walked down the narrow, carpeted hallway that separated the service area from the staff restrooms and the emergency exit. This dimly lit corridor connected directly to the estate's private administrative offices, a restricted area that guests never saw, but which I knew by heart because I had personally approved the architectural blueprints for every wall 20 years ago. Nobody stopped me. The few employees who crossed my path were too busy carrying full trays or polishing wine glasses to pay attention to a serious old woman walking with heavy steps toward the restricted zone. I reached the thick, solid oak door that separated the service hallway from the rear administrative lobby. Richard's speech, amplified by the powerful microphones in the main hall, reached this spot as a deep, unintelligible murmur, vibrating through the walls like the annoying buzz of a distant wasp swarm. I pushed the door open with my flat hand, feeling the comforting solidity of the wood against my palm and the weight of the well-oiled hinges. I stepped out into the administrative lobby, where the air conditioning was blasting, and the atmosphere was completely still and silent, totally detached from the social farce unfolding just a few yards away. I took one last step forward, crossing the threshold into the territory I ruled from the shadows. I let go of the heavy, polished brass knob and let the thick oak door slowly close behind me. The metallic click of the security lock echoed in the empty hallway, a definitive, sharp, dry sound that cut off my son-in-law's voice completely, leaving everything in a deep, absolute silence. The echo of the lock's metallic click was the first truly honest sound I had heard all afternoon. Letting go of the polished brass knob, the constant buzz of the party, the fake laughs, the clinking of crystal glasses, and my son-in-law's amplified voice were smothered behind the thick, solid oak. I found myself standing in the administrative hallway, a long, quiet corridor that breathed with the low, steady hum of the central air conditioning. There were no imported linen tablecloths or pretentious orchids here. The floor was covered by a dark gray industrial carpet designed to absorb the sound of hurried footsteps, and the walls, painted in a neutral almond tone, were decorated solely with a series of black and white photographs in simple wooden frames. I walked slowly down the hall, letting my eyes adjust to the dimmer, functional light of this area. My low-heeled shoes sank slightly into the carpet, completely muffling my advance. I paused for a moment in front of the third photograph on the left wall. It was an image taken almost 2 decades ago. In it, Arthur appeared with a white hard hat pushed back on his head, his shirt stained with plaster dust, pointing with a weathered hand at the hole where the massive bay window of the main hall now stood. Beside him was me, younger, my still dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, clutching a roll of architectural blueprints to my chest. We were dirty, exhausted, and surrounded by rubble. But on our faces, there was a smile of absolute triumph. We had bought a ruin and were building an empire with our own hands. I ran the pad of my index finger over the glass of the frame, right over my late husband's smiling face. "Look what they've done to our house, old man," I murmured into the solitude of the hallway. The knot of disappointment I had felt in the ballroom began to harden, transforming into a cold, crystalline clarity. I was no longer the humiliated mother who was sent to eat with the employees. I was once again the woman with the blueprints, the owner of every inch of dirt beneath my feet. I continued my walk until I reached the last door in the corridor. It was wider than the rest, with a brushed brass plaque in the center that read, "General Management Operations." I didn't knock. I have never had to ask permission to enter a room I built with my own money. I turned the knob and pushed the wooden door, which opened with a smooth, silent glide. The office was spacious, dominated by a massive mahogany desk in the center and a large window offering a private view of the estate's back gardens far from the guest site. Behind the desk, surrounded by folders, glowing monitors, and half-finished cups of coffee, sat Sylvia Monroe. Sylvia was the general manager of the operating agency I leased the venue to. A 48-year-old woman with impeccable posture, dressed in a navy blue tailored suit that didn't show a single wrinkle despite her long hours. Sylvia wasn't just a commercial tenant. She was a brilliant professional whom I had personally interviewed and approved when we signed the lease 10 years ago. She knew exactly how the ownership structure of Oakmont Holdings worked. She knew that the old woman in the gray dress who had just walked through her door was no ordinary guest. Hearing the door, Sylvia looked up from her screen. Her hands froze over the keyboard, her eyes widened, and she stood up so fast that her office chair rolled back and gently bumped against the window. "Mrs. Eleanor?" she exclaimed, her voice tinged with a mix of surprise and deep confusion. "My God, I didn't know you were here. Nobody at the entrance told me you had arrived. Did something happen with maintenance? Do you need anything? Please have a seat." I approached the desk with a firm step, feeling the office's atmosphere heavy with operational tension wrap around me like an old familiar coat. "They didn't tell you, because I arrived in a taxi. Sylvia and I walked through the front door like just another guest," I replied in a neutral tone, resting my black purse on the mahogany surface. "Or rather, like a second-class guest. Don't worry about the security staff. They have no reason to know my face. That's what I pay you for." Sylvia frowned, clearly thrown off balance. She came out from behind her desk and pulled up one of the heavy leather guest chairs for me. "But Mrs. Eleanor, we have a private event today. It's the Valdez family baptism. In fact, the host is Richard Valdez, the architect. I understand he is your—" Sylvia stopped dead. Her eyes widened even further as she connected the dots. She knew who my son-in-law was, even though our business interactions had always been kept strictly separate from my family life. "Wait a minute. You are the baby's great-grandmother? You should be at the head table. What are you doing back here in the offices during your son-in-law's speech?" I sat down slowly in the leather chair, feeling the comfort of the padding embrace my tired back. I folded my hands in my lap and held Sylvia's worried gaze. "My daughter and my son-in-law decided that my gray dress and my lack of a fancy last name didn't fit the aesthetic of their head table, Sylvia. They sent me to the back, right next to the kitchen doors, so I wouldn't scare off Richard's investors or the mayor." Sylvia's face went pale. The cold professionalism that defined her cracked for a second, giving way to genuine outrage. She knew my history. She knew how Arthur and I had started out selling food on the street. And above all, she knew that the lease agreement allowing her agency to operate in this highly lucrative venue depended entirely on my signature. That is unacceptable, Mrs. Eleanor. It's an appalling lack of respect. If I had known, I would have gone down there myself to seat you. This is your hall. You own all of this. Do you want me to go right now and demand the floor manager put a place setting for you right in the center? I can have anyone moved." I raised a hand, stopping her momentum. "No, Sylvia, I don't want a seat at their table. I have no interest in breaking bread with people who are ashamed of the hands that needed their fortune. What I want is information, and I want it now." Sylvia nodded, quickly recovering her executive posture. She went back to her side of the desk and sat down, ready to receive orders. "Whatever you need, Mrs. Eleanor, you name it." "I want to see the complete file for today's event. The contract, the budgets, the payment logs, the special requests, absolutely everything Richard and Chloe Valdez signed with your agency." Sylvia didn't hesitate for a second. Her fingers flew across her computer keyboard, opening the internal management system. While the laser printer in the corner began to hum and spit out warm sheets of paper, Sylvia opened a filing cabinet drawer and pulled out a thick black leather folder labeled Event 402, Valdez Baptism. She placed it on the desk, opened it, and slid the documents toward me. "Here you go," Sylvia said, adjusting her glasses. "The contract was signed just 3 weeks ago. It was an emergency booking. Your daughter was very insistent that they needed the venue to impress some key partners of Mr. Valdez. Since we had a last-minute cancellation, we gave it to them. I took my reading glasses out of my purse, put them on, and began to review the papers. The silence in the office was only broken by the sound of turning pages and my own steady breathing. I read the guest list. 200 people. I read the chosen menu. Avocado and lobster, timbale duck à l'orange with a berry reduction, chocolate truffle tart. I read the extras. A live string quartet. Floral arrangements with imported orchids, a premium open bar. It was an obscene waste of money for a simple Sunday afternoon baptism. But what I was really looking for wasn't on the menu. It was on the last page in the billing and payment terms section. My eyes scanned the figures. The total cost of the event was astronomical enough to pay for my great-grandson's entire college tuition. However, when I reached the line for deposits received, I stopped, frowned, and pulled the paper closer to the light of the desk lamp. "Sylvia," I said, keeping my voice dangerously low, "I'm looking at an initial deposit of 10% and a margin note about a promissory note. Explain this to me." Sylvia swallowed hard and leaned forward, folding her hands on the desk. Her tone became defensive, not toward me, but toward the situation she now had to justify. "It was a highly unusual negotiation, Mrs. Eleanor. Mr. Valdez came in person to sign. He told us his construction company was about to close a massive infrastructure contract with the city government. He assured us the mayor himself would attend the event as a show of support. Valdez demanded we give him a 90-day corporate line of credit to settle the remaining 90% of the event. And you agreed to finance a luxury party for him with a simple promissory note?" I asked, without raising my voice, but letting the edge of the question slice through the air. "We didn't want to." Sylvia defended herself quickly. "Our policy requires full payment a week before the event, but Valdez got very aggressive. He said he had influence, that he knew the real owners of the estate, and that if we didn't give him the credit, he would make sure we lost our operating license through his contacts at City Hall. He threatened to cause a public scandal." I consulted with my agency's board of directors, and they decided that given the political profile of the guests, it was better not to risk a legal or media problem. We accepted the 10% deposit and the promissory note in the name of Vance Construction, LLC. I let out a dry, bitter laugh that echoed in the office. I took off my glasses and dropped them onto the papers. Richard's audacity was as massive as his incompetence. Not only was he using his grandson's event to plug the financial holes in his company, but he was paying for the party with money he didn't have, extorting the operating agency, and bragging about knowing the owners of the venue. The owners, the woman in the gray dress they had just banished to the kitchen hallway. "Sylvia, do you know what the actual financial status of Vance Construction, LLC is?" I asked, looking right at her. "Only what we read in the papers, Mrs. Eleanor, that they are expanding." "They are technically bankrupt," I stated, feeling a strange relief at saying the truth out loud. "My husband saved him 3 times before dying, and now Richard is betting everything on a municipal contract he hasn't even signed yet, using my own house as a stage to fake a wealth that vanished years ago. That 90-day promissory note is a worthless piece of paper. They have no way to pay you." Sylvia covered her mouth with her hand as she processed the information. If the construction company didn't pay, the operating agency would have to absorb the total cost of the event, which represented a massive loss that would directly impact the dividends Oakmont Holdings collected at the end of the month. Before Sylvia could articulate a response, the heavy oak door of the office burst open. It wasn't a gentle push, but a violent impact that rattled the picture frames on the hallway wall. In the doorway stood Marcus, the estate's executive chef. He was a heavily built 50-year-old man dressed in a white chef's coat that showed fresh splatters of dark sauce. His face was red from the heat of the stoves and from obvious fury. He had a kitchen towel squeezed tightly in his right fist. Marcus wasn't just any employee. He was a veteran of the culinary industry, a strong-willed man who had worked with us since the days when Arthur and I were doing industrial catering. I had personally designed the layout of his ovens. There was a deep, silent loyalty between us, forged in the fire of 1,000 stressful dinner services. Marcus stormed into the office without looking to see who was sitting in the guest chair. He headed straight for Sylvia's desk. "Sylvia, I can't take another minute of these people," the chef roared, waving the towel in the air. "I just sent the VIP plates to the head table, and do you know what the lady in the emerald green dress did? She sent the plates back. She announced in front of everyone that the duck was cold and the berry reduction looked like cheap jam. She called my sous chef useless and demanded that I come out and apologize personally to the mayor. If you don't stop me, I swear to God I'm going out there and dumping the duck on her husband's head." Marcus stopped dead in his tracks, breathing heavily. That was when he looked down and saw me, sitting in the leather chair, watching him in complete silence. The fury on his face instantly morphed into surprise, and then into an almost reverential respect. His shoulders dropped and he hid the towel behind his back like a child caught pulling a prank. "Mrs. Eleanor," he murmured, lowering his voice until it became a hoarse whisper. "My God, please forgive me. I had no idea you were here. I didn't see you come through the kitchen. I am so embarrassed you had to hear me yelling like that." "Good afternoon, ma'am." I offered him a slight smile. The first honest smile I had given all day. "Good afternoon, Marcus. You have nothing to apologize for. I know exactly how the kitchen gets during the main service, and I know exactly who you're talking about. The woman in the emerald green dress is my daughter, Chloe." Marcus opened his mouth, unable to make a sound. He looked at Sylvia for help, but the manager just nodded slowly, confirming the social nightmare they had just walked into. "Mrs. Eleanor, I didn't know. I am so sorry. If I had known it was your family—" "If you had known it was my family, you would have done the exact same thing, Marcus, because you are a professional, and your food is impeccable." I interrupted him, raising a hand. "The problem isn't your duck à l'orange. The problem is that my daughter and her husband need to humiliate the staff to feel important in front of their guests of the hour. I myself was the victim of their need for control 10 minutes ago, when they sent me to sit in the back because I wasn't elegant enough for their table." Marcus pressed his lips together, and his dark eyes flashed with an outrage he made no attempt to hide. He remembered Arthur. He remembered how we treated our people. "What do you want us to do, Mrs. Eleanor?" the chef asked, his voice now firm, stripped of any apology. He was ready for orders loyal to the only real authority in that building. I looked at the contract documents scattered across the desk. I thought about the strain on my hands, sewing Leo's gown in the early hours of the morning. I thought about Richard's arrogance, signing a bad check, propped up by lies and extortion. I thought about the look in Chloe's eyes when she told me I didn't fit in with the important people. The emotional clock had hit zero. Patience, that virtue I had cultivated for 72 years, dried up in an instant, replaced by absolute determination. I stood up slowly, resting both hands on the mahogany surface. I looked at Sylvia and then at Marcus. I had my two executive allies in the same room, the administrative authority and the operational authority. "Sylvia," I said, pointing at the contract with my index finger. "Clause 8 of the master lease agreement, the one Oakmont Holdings signed with your agency, stipulates that the property owner has the unilateral and unappealable right to suspend any ongoing event if fraud, non-payment, or risk to the venue's reputation is detected. Is that correct?" Sylvia nodded, her eyes locked on mine. "That is correct, Mrs. Eleanor. It's a standard asset protection clause." "Perfect. And the contract Richard signed with you stipulates that the agency can cancel the service immediately if the client displays abusive behavior toward the staff, or if it is discovered that the financial information provided for credit was falsified. Is that also correct?" "Yes, ma'am. Clause 4, Section B." "Good. Then we are going to enforce both." I ruled, my voice sounding cold and metallic in the quiet of the office. "Sylvia, I want you to draft the cancellation order right now for breach of payment and fraudulent guarantees." "Marcus." The chef straightened up, almost at attention. "Tell me, boss." "Go back to the kitchen. Stop the main course service. Nobody else eats. Turn off the ovens. Pull the trays from the service stations, and tell your waiters to fall back to the break area. The Valdez family event is officially over." Marcus cracked a half smile, a fierce gesture of repressed satisfaction. He nodded, turned on his heel, and walked out of the office, closing the door behind him, much softer than when he entered. Sylvia was already typing furiously on her computer, preparing the legal document that would back my decision. I stood by the window, watching the wind move the branches of the ash trees Arthur had planted. The machinery was in motion. The trap, woven with the very threads of my daughter's arrogance, was about to snap shut on them. We didn't have to wait long for the impact. Barely 5 minutes after Marcus left, the sound of high heels aggressively striking the hallway carpet announced the arrival of the storm. The office door flew open with such force that it bounced off the rubber wall stop. There stood Chloe. Her emerald silk dress looked even tighter from the tension in her body. Her face, usually a mask of control and expensive cosmetics, was disfigured by impatient rage. She had abandoned her political guests to come and solve the problem with her own hands, convinced that the whole world should bow to her whims. "Sylvia!" Chloe yelled, storming into the office without even glancing toward the window. "Can you tell me what the hell is wrong with your staff? We've been waiting 20 minutes for them to replace the main courses. The chef is an insolent prick who refuses to come out, and now the waiters are disappearing from the hall. The mayor is asking me if there's a problem. I demand you fix this immediately, or I will make sure that—" Chloe stopped dead. The words died in her throat. Finally, her peripheral vision caught me standing by the window. She turned her head slowly as if she couldn't believe what her eyes were showing her. The silence that followed was dense, heavy, loaded with decades of misunderstandings and slights. Chloe looked me up and down, scanning my gray dress, my black purse on the mahogany desk, and my relaxed posture in front of the agency's general manager. "Mom," she whispered, blinking rapidly. "What are you doing in here? Why aren't you at the table I assigned you? What are you doing hiding in the offices, bothering the manager in the middle of a crisis?" I didn't answer immediately. I let her confusion grow, let the poison of her own questions settle into the air of the room. I walked over to the desk with calculated slowness. Sylvia, maintaining an icy composure, printed the cancellation sheet, stamped it with the agency's official seal, and slid it toward my side of the desk, next to a black ink pen. I picked up the pen and looked Chloe straight in the eyes. There was no trace of the compliant affection she had always taken for granted. There was only the look of a woman who had decided to stop being invisible. "I'm not hiding, Chloe," I replied with a calm that seemed to destabilize her even more. "And I'm not bothering the manager. I'm doing my job, something you and your husband forgot to do when you decided to throw a party with someone else's money on a property you don't own." Chloe frowned, taking a step back, as if my words were a foreign language she couldn't decipher. "What are you talking about? What job, Mom? Please stop talking nonsense and go back to your seat. I don't have time for your drama. I have 200 important guests waiting for their food." "No, Chloe," I said, leaning over the desk and signing the cancellation document with a firm, definitive stroke. "You no longer have guests, and there is no more food, because as the absolute owner of this estate and Oakmont Holdings, I have just canceled your event." I dropped the pen. The sound of the plastic hitting the wood echoed like a gunshot in the silence of the office. Chloe looked at the paper, then at Sylvia, and finally at me. And for the first time in her life, absolute terror replaced the arrogance in her eyes. The sound of the plastic pen hitting the mahogany wood echoed like a lone gunshot in the absolute silence of the office. Chloe looked at the paper I had just signed, then at Sylvia, and finally locked her eyes on me. For the first time in her 45 years of life, pure, absolute terror replaced the arrogance in her gaze. Her pupils dilated, frantically searching for a logical explanation, a loophole to escape the reality that had just crashed down on her shoulders. Her perfectly manicured hands, adorned with diamond rings her husband hadn't finished paying for, gripped the edge of the desk so tightly her knuckles turned white. She opened her mouth to speak, but only a choked sound came from her throat, an inarticulate babble completely devoid of the educated, pretentious diction she tried so hard to maintain in front of her friends. What is this?" she finally managed to articulate, her voice trembling, high-pitched and stripped of any authority. "What kind of sick joke is this, Sylvia? My mother has no authority to sign anything here. My father owned everything, and when he died, the estate went into a family trust. She only gets a pension. She just used to sew the tablecloths in the old days." I didn't move. I stood with my back straight and my hands resting firmly on the cold surface of the desk. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel that hot, uncontrollable rage that clouds judgment. What I felt was a deep, dark, heavy pity. Pity at seeing how my own daughter, the little girl whose hair I had brushed and whose scraped knees I had bandaged, had rewritten our family's history to fit her narrative of disdain. To her, I was never the founding partner. I was never the woman who drew up the blueprints for this very estate by candlelight when they cut the power at our first storefront. To Chloe, I had always been an accessory, a useful tool kept in a drawer until important visitors arrived. Sylvia adjusted the glasses on the bridge of her nose, maintaining an icy, professional composure that contrasted brutally with my daughter's nervous breakdown. "Mrs. Valdez, I suggest you watch your words," Sylvia said, her tone neutral but sharp as glass. "Mrs. Eleanor does not receive a pension. Mrs. Eleanor is the chairman of the board and the majority shareholder of Oakmont Holdings, with 98% of the shares in her name. The remaining 2% belongs to a trust fund in the name of your nephew David. Mr. Arthur left very precise instructions before he passed away. You do not appear in the ownership structure of this land, this building, or the company that leases the facilities to us. Legally, your mother is the sole owner of every square inch of the Ashwood estate, and she has just exercised her contractual right to cancel your event due to financial risk and abusive behavior." Chloe let go of the desk as if the wood had burned the palms of her hands. She took an erratic step backward, stumbling clumsily over the edge of the thick industrial carpet. Her breathing became rapid and shallow, inflating and deflating the emerald silk of her designer dress at an alarming rate. She shook her head over and over, as if the physical movement could erase the words she had just heard. "No. No, that's impossible. Dad wouldn't have done that. Dad adored me." "Dad knew Richard and I needed backing for our projects. He wouldn't have left me out." "You're manipulating her," Chloe screamed, pointing an accusing finger at me that visibly trembled. "You're senile, Mom. You don't know what you're signing. You're ruining your own great-grandson's baptism over a stupid whim because you got offended over a chair. You're a bitter, jealous old woman." The words bounced off the office walls, filling the space with the accumulated toxicity of decades of unspoken silences. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second. The memory of my late husband Arthur appeared in my mind with overwhelming clarity. I remembered the rainy night we signed the incorporation papers 15 years ago. We were sitting at the kitchen table in our old house. Arthur had his glasses pushed down to the tip of his nose and held my hand over the paper. "Our daughter has an empty heart and loose hands, Eleanor," he had told me that night, a sadness carving deep lines into his face. "We love her, but we gave her so much comfort that we neutered her character. If we leave her in control of our life's work, she'll lose it all in a year trying to impress people who don't love her. And worse, she'll let that good-for-nothing Richard drag her into ruin. Everything stays in your name, my old girl. You are the wall." I had paid their debts in secret. I had sewn their clothes so they could fake a status they didn't have. I had cleaned up their messes in the dead of night, but the wall was tired of taking hits. I opened my eyes and held Chloe's deranged gaze. "Your father loved you deeply, Chloe," I said, my voice so low and firm that it forced her to stop screaming just to hear me. "He loved you so much that he decided to protect you from your own vanity. And no, I am not senile. My mind is clearer than it has ever been in my life. And this isn't about a chair. It's not about you sending me to the back of the room like a bag of trash you didn't want your friends to see. It's about this." I held up the original event contract and the promissory note Richard had signed. I held it in the air under the white light of Sylvia's desk lamp. "It's about the fact that your husband came into my house, the house your father and I built, carrying bags of cement, and signed a fraudulent document. You agreed to pay a fortune you don't have, using a fake 90-day credit line backed by a construction company that is technically bankrupt. You came to extort my manager, threatening her with political connections to get a free luxury party. You used the sacrament of my great-grandson, an innocent baby, as a grotesque excuse to put on a stage play and trick a mayor into signing a contract to save you from misery." Chloe turned so pale that the expensive makeup on her cheeks suddenly looked like a wax mask peeling off her skin. She swallowed hard. She knew I had hit the nail on the head. She knew her financial house of cards was collapsing in real time right in front of her eyes. "Mom, please." Her voice broke instantly, losing all its haughtiness, turning into the pathetic plea of a cornered animal. "The mayor is out there. The Chicago investors are at table 2. If the food doesn't come out, if they find out the event is canceled, we're dead. Richard needs that municipal contract. If he doesn't get it, the bank is going to foreclose on the house next month. We'll lose everything. We'll be out on the street. How can you do this to your own family? How can you be so cruel?" "You were already dead, Chloe," I replied, relentlessly refusing to let pity soften my hand. "You just wanted to use my money and my property to pay for the coffin so the funeral would look pretty. And as for family, don't you dare use that word with me. Family doesn't banish a mother to the service table because her dress doesn't have a French label. Family doesn't throw a patched-up lace gown in your face at 3 in the morning without a word of thanks. You kicked me out of your family a long time ago, the day you decided my humble origins were a stain on your social resume. I am merely finalizing the divorce." Before Chloe could let out the wail of desperation building in her throat, the violent sound of the doorknob turning shattered the tension in the office. The heavy oak door flew open with such force, it slammed against the rubber wall stop with a dull thud. It was Richard. My son-in-law charged into the room like an enraged bull, sweating profusely inside his lightweight wool suit, which now looked too tight on him due to the stress. The silk tie he had smugly adjusted in front of the mirror minutes ago now hung loose around his neck. His face, usually rehearsed to display fake corporate friendliness, was red and contorted in a grimace of impatient fury. He didn't look toward the corner where I was standing. His tunnel vision was entirely focused on Sylvia and his wife. "Chloe, what the hell are you doing hiding in here?" Richard bellowed, waving his arms in the air. "I've been trying to keep the mayor entertained with stupid anecdotes for 20 minutes. The tables are empty. I went to the kitchen, and the ovens are off. The waiters are sitting around drinking water. It's a damn mutiny." Richard marched toward the desk, planting both hands on the wood and leaning his face toward Sylvia, in a posture of physical intimidation, disgusting and cowardly. "Listen to me, you third-rate clerk," he spat at Sylvia, the veins in his neck bulging. "I don't know what kind of union problem you have in this pigsty, but you are going to march into that kitchen right now and force your chef to serve those plates. And if you don't, I swear to God, tomorrow morning I will use all my influence at City Hall to get your operating license revoked. I will sink this agency, and I will make sure you never work in this city again. I am Richard Valdez, and nobody humiliates me like this." Sylvia didn't flinch. She didn't step back a single millimeter. She simply folded her hands in her lap and looked at Richard with an expression of absolute boredom. The exact same expression one reserves for a spoiled child throwing a tantrum in a supermarket. It was then that Richard, not receiving the immediate submission he expected, turned his head looking for support and saw me. He saw me standing there calm, with my black purse hanging from my forearm and my gray dress perfectly smoothed. His brain seemed to short-circuit for a second. He furrowed his brow, confused by my presence in that administrative sanctuary reserved for the supposed owners of the world. "And what are you doing here, Eleanor?" he asked, using my first name with that casual disrespect that had always defined him. For him, I was always just the annoying mother-in-law who didn't fit in. "I told you clearly this morning to stay away from the head table. Did you come back here to cry to the manager because you didn't like your chair? For the love of God, Chloe, get your mother out of here. Take her to the kitchen and give her a bowl of soup, but get her out of my sight. I don't have time to deal with this woman's inferiority complexes while my career is on the line." The silence that followed his words was dense, almost solid. You could cut it with a knife. Chloe brought both hands to her face, covering her mouth as if to stifle a scream of terror. She knew her husband's words had just sealed their fate definitively and irrevocably. I didn't let Chloe speak. I didn't let her protect him. I took a step forward, closing the distance between Richard and me. My low heels made no sound, but my presence suddenly seemed to fill every corner of the massive office. "I am not here complaining about a chair, Richard," I said, my tone icy and deliberate, pronouncing every syllable with the precision of an executioner sharpening his axe. "I am here because the manager needed my signature to execute an urgent administrative procedure." Richard let out a harsh, contemptuous laugh. He ran a hand through his slicked-back hair, looking at me as if I had lost my mind. "Your signature? What the hell does this agency need a signature from an old woman who spends her time knitting baby booties for? Are you authorizing them to buy more yarn? Chloe, please get this woman out of here before I call security." She needed my signature. I continued, ignoring his interruption and raising my voice just enough to dominate the room, because the lease agreement that allows this agency to operate on this property stipulates that only the absolute owner of the Ashwood estate can order the immediate cancellation of an ongoing event due to fraud and falsified financial guarantees. Richard blinked. The mocking smile froze on his face, morphing into a grotesque grimace. He looked at Sylvia, expecting the manager to burst out laughing and deny my insanity. But Sylvia just nodded slowly, holding up the document I had just signed and showing it right to his face. Mrs. Eleanor is the majority shareholder of Oakmont Holdings and the legal owner of this property, Mr. Valdez, Sylvia confirmed with lethal clarity. And she has just exercised her right to cancel your event. The ovens are off. The service staff has been pulled. There will be no food, no drinks, and no music. Your party is over. The physical impact of the words on Richard's body was fascinating to watch. It was like seeing a building implode in slow motion. His shoulders slumped, his chest deflated, and his legs seemed to tremble beneath his fine wool trousers. He took a step back, bumping clumsily into the leather guest chair. He looked at Chloe, desperate for her to deny the nightmare. "Chloe," Richard murmured, his voice broken and hoarse. "Tell me this is a joke. Tell me your mother isn't. Tell me Arthur didn't leave her." "It's true, Richard," Chloe sobbed, dropping her hands from her face, revealing her smeared makeup and bloodshot eyes. "It's all hers. It was always hers. The company, the land, the hall, everything. She just canceled us." Richard dropped heavily into the leather chair. The air seemed to leave his lungs all at once. The arrogant architect with the illustrious last name. The man who, 10 minutes ago, was strutting in front of the mayor and humiliating my employees had been reduced to a sack of trembling meat in a matter of seconds. He loosened his tie even more, as if suddenly there was no oxygen left in the climate-controlled office. Silence reigned again, interrupted only by my daughter's muffled sobs and my son-in-law's erratic breathing. I took my time observing them. For years, they had built a fortress of lies and appearances, financing their contempt for me with the sweat of my own labor. And now, with a simple signature and a few words, I had torn their walls down to the foundation. Suddenly, the lowest, most crawling survival instinct took over Richard. He jumped up, but this time there was no aggression in his movements. There was desperation. He walked toward me, hunched over, diminished, trying to force a conciliatory smile that looked more like a grimace of pain. "Ellie, mother-in-law," he started to say, raising his hands in a gesture of peaceful surrender. The nickname caused a deep revulsion in my stomach. "There's been a terrible misunderstanding. A miscommunication, that's all. Chloe must have gotten confused with the tables. You know we adore you. You're the matriarch of this family. Please, we can't do this today." "Not today, and don't call me Ellie," I cut him off, my voice cracking like a whip. "And there is no misunderstanding. The only mistake was yours. Believing you could pay for a party for 200 guests with a 90-day promissory note that isn't worth the paper it's printed on. I know your construction company's numbers, Richard. I know you're on the verge of foreclosure. I know you used this baptism to fake solvency in front of the mayor and beg him for a municipal contract to save your own skin. You tried to use my property to finance your fraud." Richard turned even paler. The fact that I knew the dark secrets of his accounting finally broke his spirit. He fell to his knees. Literally, the great Mr. Valdez bent his knees on the gray carpet of the office, clasping his hands in front of his chest. "Please, Eleanor, I'm begging you," he whimpered, real tears of panic welling up in his eyes. "If the mayor walks out that door without having eaten, offended by the treatment, he will never sign the contract. If I don't sign that public works deal, the bank will seize everything next week. We'll lose the house, we'll lose the company cars. I'll even drag David down. I made him co-sign a bridge loan. If I fall, your grandson David and his wife Sarah will lose their house too. You'll leave your newborn great-grandson out on the street. Is that what you want? To destroy your own blood over a fit of pride, using David and Sarah as human shields was the lowest, most predictable move from a cornered coward." I felt a pang of pain thinking about David. My grandson was a good boy, hardworking and honest, but he had inherited his mother's weakness for being manipulated by authority figures. Richard had convinced him to mortgage his future to save the construction company's bad decisions. I took a deep breath, keeping a cool head. I wasn't going to let emotional blackmail steer me off course. David and Sarah will be fine, I replied, looking down at him with absolute coldness. I will personally pay off my grandson's debt first thing Monday morning. I have more than enough funds to protect the ones who actually matter in this family. They won't lose their house. But you, Richard, you are going to lose every last fake cent you pretend to have. Your papier-mâché empire ends today. Chloe ran over and knelt next to her husband, clinging to Richard's arm while looking at me with pleading eyes. Mom, I'm begging you. I'm sorry about the table. I'm sorry about everything. I was stupid. I was ungrateful. I admit it. I'll kneel before you if you want, but don't expose us out there. Not in front of all those people. Just tell them to turn the ovens back on. Let them serve the damn duck. Let us cut the cake. Let us take the official photo. And I swear to you, we'll leave town tomorrow if you want. I'll sign the company shares over to you. I'll give you whatever you ask for. Just let us keep our dignity in front of the mayor. Just one more hour of the farce, I'm begging you. I looked at my daughter and my son-in-law kneeling on the floor of my office, begging for the scraps of an illusion they had destroyed themselves. They had spent their entire lives trampling on those they considered inferior, and now they begged for mercy with the same mouths they used to spit poison. The poetic justice of the scene was undeniable, but it brought me no joy. It only confirmed what Arthur always knew. They were rotten to the core. Slowly, I bent down, but not to comfort them. I reached out, grabbed the black purse sitting on the desk, and hung it firmly over my forearm. I straightened up, adjusting the pleats of my self-made gray dress. No, Chloe, no more farces. I am not going to use my workers' food to feed your husband's fraud. I decreed, my unbreakable voice echoing off the walls. You wanted an event for the important people, and the important people are already sitting out there waiting. Richard looked up, confused, his face soaked in tears and sweat. What are you going to do, Eleanor? Are you going to go out there and tell them there's no food? No, Richard, I said, turning toward the solid oak door. The three of us are going back out there together. Chloe stood up clumsily, pulling on her husband's arm to help him up. Go back out there, Mom. We can't go out to the hall without the waiters. They're going to massacre us with questions. The mayor will demand to know what's going on. It'll be a public humiliation. I paused with my hand resting on the polished brass knob. I turned my head slightly over my shoulder and looked at them with a calm that must have seemed absolutely terrifying. You are going to walk back to your beautiful head table adorned with orchids, I ordered with the irrefutable authority of someone holding every card in the deck. You are going to sit down next to the mayor and the Chicago investors, and I am going to walk over to the plastic table by the kitchen doors, exactly where you decided my place was, Chloe. But the plates are empty, Richard babbled, trembling. People are going to start complaining. Exactly, I replied, pulling the heavy oak door open and letting the distant buzz of 200 impatient guests flood the hallway once again. And from my seat in the back, I am going to enjoy every single second of watching the important people figure out that their hosts can't even afford to offer them a glass of water. Let's go. It's time to face the music. The administrative hallway seemed to have doubled in length. I walked with measured steps, feeling the firmness of the industrial carpet under my low heels. Behind me, the sound of my daughter's ragged breathing and my son-in-law's clumsy shuffling formed a pathetic funeral march. I didn't look back to check if they were following me. I knew they were. Fear has a very specific way of chaining people, and in that moment I was holding the end of the chain. Passing by the black and white photograph of Arthur and me in front of the estate's rubble, I felt a draft of cold air slide down the back of my neck. It was as if the building itself was breathing, preparing to expel the infection that had tried to parasitize its foundations. The swinging doors connecting to the kitchen appeared in front of us. I pushed them open with both hands. The contrast with the chaos I'd witnessed barely half an hour ago was so brutal that Chloe let out a muffled groan behind my back. The kitchen, the beating heart of any event, was clinically dead. The massive stainless steel industrial stoves, which earlier roared with blue flames and emitted the intoxicating aroma of duck à l'orange and spices, were now off, cold and silent. The powerful lights of the exhaust hoods had been dimmed to half their intensity, plunging the massive space into a metallic gloom. Marcus, the executive chef, stood in front of the center island with his arms crossed over his sturdy chest. He was no longer holding the stained kitchen towel. He had changed his coat for a completely clean white one. Around him, the entire brigade of cooks and waiters was lined up in absolute silence. They had cleared all the service trays. The avocado and lobster timbales that Chloe had contemptuously sent back were being methodically tossed into compost bins by two prep cooks. It was the very image of the end, an end Richard refused to accept. He tried to scrape together an ounce of his shattered authority. He stepped forward, separating from Chloe, and pointed a trembling finger at Marcus, invading the chef's space. "You listen to me cook," Richard babbled, though his voice lacked any of the volume and arrogance it had minutes ago. "I order you to turn those ovens on right now. Put out food, whatever it is. Throw some steaks on the grill. Bring out bread. Bring out whatever you have. I'll pay you double today's salary in cash if you save me from this." Marcus didn't even blink. He didn't move a single muscle in his weathered face. His dark eyes bypassed Richard's shoulder and locked directly onto mine, seeking the only confirmation that mattered to him in that entire building. I held his gaze and slowly shook my head. A movement of barely a fraction of an inch was enough. "The kitchen is closed, Mr. Valdez," Marcus replied with a deep voice that echoed off the spotless steel walls. "And my loyalty cannot be bought with money you don't have. Collect your guests and clear the hall." Richard opened his mouth to argue, but the sound of a porcelain plate shattering into the garbage bin made him shrink into himself. Chloe grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the service hallway. She was terrified of the employees she had humiliated all morning. Now she knew that every single one of them had more power in this house than she did. I walked past them, opening the door leading to the staff break area, right behind the black velvet curtain, separating our world from the main hall. "Go to your table," I ordered without raising my voice, stopping right on the threshold. "The mayor is waiting for you. You have a role to play in front of the important people. Don't keep him waiting any longer." Chloe looked at me, her eyes filled with tears, the black mascara forming two dirty streaks down her cheeks. She clung to my arm, a desperate gesture that reminded me of when she was 5 years old and broke a vase in the house, looking for me to glue the broken pieces back together. "Mom, please don't make me go out there. I can't look at their faces. They'll know we're a fraud. They'll know we have nothing. They'll destroy me at the club, at the luncheons. The mayor's wife will tear me to shreds. Let me leave out the back door. Let me take David and Leo and we'll all go. Say there was a medical emergency. Say I fainted. Whatever. But don't force me to face those people empty-handed." I broke free from her grip with a firm movement but devoid of violence. I looked her up and down, taking in the emerald silk dress, cutting off her breath, the jewelry bought on credit to impress strangers, the stiff hairsprayed hairstyle now starting to crumble from the cold sweat on her forehead. "Respect isn't demanded by shouting, Chloe. It is earned in silence," I said, pronouncing every word with an icy clarity. "And I am not forcing this humiliation on you. You built it yourself, brick by brick, when you decided that appearances were worth more than loyalty. You wanted an exclusive place for the important people. Now go occupy it. Get out there." I didn't give them time to react. I pulled back the heavy velvet curtain and stepped into the blinding light of the main hall. The murmur of 200 impatient people hit me like a wave of physical heat. The string quartet had stopped playing, probably because their contracted time was up, or because they sensed with the finely tuned instinct of event musicians that something was terribly wrong. In the absence of music, the sound of silver cutlery clinking against empty crystal glasses and the buzz of complaints formed a tense, almost electric atmosphere. The air conditioning was still blasting, but the room felt heavy, suffocating. I walked straight to the small round table against the wall, my designated place in exile. The metal folding chair was still there, with my gray wool coat folded over the back, exactly as I had left it. I sat down slowly. The metallic creak under my weight was the only sound keeping me company in that dark corner. From this strategic position, the view was unbeatable. The hall looked like a giant chessboard, where the pieces had just realized the game was rigged. To my left, I watched Chloe and Richard emerge from behind the curtain. They walked stiffly, as if they had wooden planks tied to their backs. Chloe had tried to wipe away the running mascara, but only managed to smear a grayish shadow under her eyes, giving her the sickly look of a ghost dripping in jewels. Richard buttoned his suit jacket, trying to project an image of control that crumbled with every hesitant step he took toward the center of the dance floor. While they made their walk of shame, a young waiter in immaculate white gloves approached my table. It was the same boy I had crossed paths with earlier, the one who bumped into the leg of my chair. He carried a small silver tray. With a silent bow full of genuine respect, he placed a steaming porcelain teacup in front of me. "Chef Marcus asked me to bring you your chamomile tea with honey, Mrs. Eleanor," the young man murmured, keeping his head slightly bowed. "He said it would help you enjoy the show." I flashed a half smile, picking up the cup by its delicate handle. The heat of the tea seeped through my fingers, comforting my tired joints. "Thank you, son. Tell Marcus he's absolutely right." The waiter nodded, took a step back, and stood by the kitchen doors, clasping his hands behind his back, assuming the posture of a sentinel guarding his queen. I took a sip of tea and locked my gaze on table 1, the center of the room, the altar of the vein. Richard and Chloe finally reached their seats. Mayor Miller, a heavy-set man with a reddened face and thinning hair, was sitting to the right of the head of the table. He had been drumming his thick fingers on the linen tablecloth for over half an hour. Beside him, his wife, the same woman Chloe had walked into the church with, completely ignoring me, was fanning herself frantically with the parchment-printed menu. Across from them, the 3 Chicago investors men in flawless gray suits stared at their cell phones with expressions ranging from absolute boredom to open irritation. The moment Richard touched the back of his chair, Mayor Miller stopped drumming his fingers and turned to him. Although the hall was massive, the acoustics Arthur and I had designed were perfect. Voices carried easily, and the tense silence from the rest of the guests amplified any conversation in the center. "Valdez, for the love of God, can you tell me what is going on here?" the mayor demanded, his raspy voice cutting through the air like a saw. "We've been waiting 45 minutes for the main course. The glasses are empty and the waiters have mysteriously disappeared. My wife's blood sugar is crashing, and the investors have flights to catch tonight. Is this the famous hospitality you were bragging about at the golf club?" Richard swallowed so hard I could see his Adam's apple bob from my table in the back. He loosened his tie, a pathetic gesture of pure nerves, and tried to flash his corporate smile. It was a spectacular failure. His lips trembled as if he were about to cry. "Mr. Mayor, I offer you my most sincere apologies," Richard stammered, resting both hands on the table to stop his body from visibly shaking in front of his guests. We've had a minor technical issue in the kitchen. Nothing to worry about, I assure you. A blown fuse, I believe. They're already fixing it. The food will be out any second." The mayor's wife let out a dry laugh, completely devoid of humor. She dropped the menu on the table with disdain. "A blown fuse? Richard, darling, I've hosted charity events at this estate dozens of times. I know the management agency. They have backup generators that could light up a stadium in 3 seconds. Don't give me cheap excuses. The service here is flawless. If there's no food, it's because someone made a colossal mistake, and I highly doubt it was the electrician." Chloe, sitting on the other side of the mayor, tried to intervene. Her voice, usually sharp, bossy, and full of self-importance, came out as a cracked whisper. "Margaret, please, I assure you everything is under control. The chef is a bit temperamental. You know how these culinary artists are. They demand perfection, and it takes time. They'll serve us right away, I promise." One of the Chicago investors, a gray-haired man with the eyes of a hawk, put his phone in the inside pocket of his jacket and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He didn't look at Chloe. He locked his eyes directly on Richard. "With all due respect, Mrs. Valdez, my time is money," the investor said, wonderfully direct. "We flew from Chicago exclusively because your husband assured us that today we would be celebrating the signing of the new municipal development with the mayor. But all I see is a paralyzed party, empty tables, and a host sweating bullets. If your construction company handles public works with the same efficiency it uses to organize a family baptism, I highly doubt we want to risk our capital with you. The impact of those words was devastating. Richard turned the color of old ash. The contract that was going to save him from bankruptcy was evaporating before his eyes, destroyed by the very people he had tried to impress at the cost of my dignity and my wealth. The tension at the head table began to radiate out to the rest of the room like an invisible gas. At table 3, I saw my grandson David stand up with little Leo in his arms. The baby had started crying, irritated by the muffled noise, the heat of the suits, and the lack of attention. Sarah, his wife, looked terrified toward her in-laws, sensing that disaster was imminent. Poor Sarah. It wasn't her fault she married into a pit of vipers. I made a mental note to call her the next day, to assure her that the roof over her son's head was safe, no matter what happened to her father-in-law's construction company. Mayor Miller, finally losing the last shred of his patience, raised a hand in the air and snapped his fingers, calling over one of his assistants, a young man in a dark suit standing near the main entrance. "Robert, go to the kitchen immediately," the mayor ordered, completely ignoring Richard's presence, treating him no longer as a partner, but as a nuisance. "Find the manager of this place and tell them the mayor of the city demands an explanation for this disaster. And if they don't have the food ready in 5 minutes, tell my driver to start the SUV. We're getting out of here." The assistant nodded and started walking quickly toward the swinging doors, in my direction. Richard jumped out of his chair, throwing his arms out in a desperate attempt to stop him. No, that's not necessary, Mr. Mayor," Richard yelled, finally losing control of his volume. Several guests at nearby tables turned their heads, alarmed by the architect's hysterical tone. "I'll go myself. I'll fix this right now. I know the owners. I have influence here." But it was too late. The mayor's assistant walked right past my table, ignored me completely, pushed through the kitchen doors, and vanished into the gloom of the service hallway. Those were the longest 30 seconds of Richard Valdez's life. He stood paralyzed next to his chair, his arms hanging uselessly at his sides, his eyes empty. Watching the seconds on the invisible clock of his ruin tick down to 0. Chloe covered her face with both hands. She no longer cared about her makeup, her posture, or her diamonds. Panic had consumed her entirely. She was huddled in her luxury chair, wishing she could turn invisible. The swinging doors opened again. The mayor's assistant walked out, strode quickly and firmly to the head table, and leaned in to whisper something into Miller's ear. I watched, fascinated, as the politician's face went from pure irritation to disbelief, and finally to a furious outrage that turned his cheeks purple. Miller slammed both hands on the table and stood up slowly. His chair scraped against the marble floor with a violent screech that echoed through the hall, instantly silencing the few remaining conversations. The silence that fell over the room was absolute, suffocating. 200 pairs of eyes were fixed on the table of the important people. "A blown fuse, Valdez," the mayor roared. His voice bounced off the high ceilings and the crystal chandeliers Arthur had hung with such effort. "My assistant just went into the kitchen. The stoves are off. The service stations are empty. There isn't a single plate of food being prepared in this building. The waiters are sitting around drinking water. The cleaning staff is packing things up. Do you think I'm an idiot?" Richard took a step back, holding up his hands in a pathetic begging gesture, as if trying to stop an avalanche with open palms. "Mr. Mayor, I swear to you there is a terrible misunderstanding. This operating agency is incompetent. They are extorting me. They're sabotaging me out of political jealousy. I paid for this event. I am close friends with the owners of this estate." That was the signal, the exact phrase that would trigger the final destruction. Before the mayor could respond to Richard's ridiculous lie, the sound of firm, rhythmic heels broke the silence of the hall. From the side corridor connecting to the administrative offices emerged Sylvia Monroe. The general manager walked with the unbreakable posture of a general entering an already conquered battlefield. In her hands, she carried an open black leather folder, displaying the cancellation document with my ink still fresh. Sylvia didn't stop at the edge of the dance floor. She walked straight to table 1, parting the sea of dumbfounded guests with decisive steps. Her face was a mask of lethal professionalism, completely unfazed by the social chaos. She stopped 6 feet from the head table, facing the mayor and a Richard who looked on the verge of a heart attack. "Good afternoon, everyone," Sylvia announced. She didn't use a microphone, but her clear, authoritative voice, trained to direct crowds and resolve crises, carried perfectly to every corner of the room. "My name is Sylvia Monroe, General Manager of the Ashwood Estate Operating Agency. I deeply apologize for the confusion and discomfort you are experiencing this afternoon." Mayor Miller crossed his arms over his chest, glaring at her, demanding answers with the sheer posture of his heavy frame. "Ms. Monroe, I demand an immediate explanation. Why has the service for this event been stopped? Is there any truth to what Mr. Valdez says about an extortion attempt by your company against his family?" Sylvia flashed a smile that didn't reach her eyes, a cold, surgical smile designed to cut the lie off at the root. She turned her head slightly to look at Richard, who was shaking so violently that his silverware was clinking against the crystal glasses. "No, Mr. Mayor, there is no extortion on our part," Sylvia replied, holding up the black folder so everyone at the head table could see the legal documents and the official seal. "The service for this event has been permanently and unilaterally canceled, in strict adherence to our security protocols. And the reason is very simple: fraud and falsification of financial guarantees by the host present here." A deafening murmur erupted in the hall. 200 members of local high society held their breath at the exact same time. The politicians' wives brought their hands to their mouths. The Chicago investors looked at each other, nodding, slowly, confirming their worst suspicions about the construction company's solvency. Chloe sobbed openly, burying her face in the imported linen tablecloth she had so fiercely demanded. "It's a lie!" Richard screamed in one last, desperate attempt to salvage his prestige from the ashes. His voice cracked into a high, embarrassing squeak that echoed throughout the venue. "I handed over a corporate promissory note. My company has more than enough funds. You are defaming me in front of my guests, and you are going to pay for this. I demand the owner of this place come out right now. Tell your bosses to show their faces. I demand to speak with the owners of Oakmont Holdings so they fire you this instant." Sylvia closed the leather folder with a sharp snap. She kept her eyes locked on Richard for 3 long seconds, letting the echo of his pathetic shouting completely fade away beneath the steady hum of the air conditioning. Then, with a calm that chilled the blood, Sylvia raised her right hand, extended her arm, and pointed directly to the back of the room, toward the small round table with no tablecloth, far from the warm lights of the center, toward the metal folding chair by the swinging kitchen doors, toward the area where only invisible people were supposed to go, toward me. "The owner of Oakmont Holdings doesn't need to come out from anywhere, Mr. Valdez," Sylvia said, and her voice struck with the force of a hammer driving the final nail into my son-in-law's coffin. "The absolute owner of this estate, of this company, and of the ground you are standing on, has been present the entire time. It was she who personally ordered the cancellation of your event. Because important people, Mr. Valdez, do not pay for their parties with bad checks." The effect was immediate and absolute, as if they were all connected by the same invisible string. The 200 guests, Mayor Miller, the stern investors from the north, my grandson David, and finally Richard, turned their heads in unison. A sea of pale, confused faces turned toward the back of the hall, searching for the figure of power who had just crushed the great architect Valdez in front of the entire city. And there I was, the woman in the self-made gray dress, the old woman they hadn't considered worthy enough to share their table, the mother they hid next to the service staff so her origins wouldn't ruin the official baptism photos. I didn't stand up. I didn't shout. I didn't need to make any dramatic gestures or give a victory speech. I simply sat there in my folding chair, holding my porcelain cup. With both hands, I held Richard's terrified gaze from 50 yards away, watching the crushing weight of the truth shatter his knees. The silence in the hall was so deep, so dense, that I could clearly hear the faint clink of my spoon grazing the edge of the cup as I took the last sip of my chamomile tea. Richard Valdez, the man who had sent me to the back for not being an important person, was about to discover that the invisible woman in the corner was the sole owner of the sky that had just fallen on his head, and I had absolutely no intention of helping him pick up the rubble. Mayor Miller took a step toward him, breaking the paralysis of the moment. "This is your mother-in-law, Valdez," Miller asked, pointing at me with his chin, a deep disgust twisting his features. "The woman I saw sitting in the third row at the church?" Richard couldn't answer. His lips moved frantically, but no sound came from his tight throat. He suddenly seemed unable to find air in the massive hall. Meanwhile, my gaze, cold, patient, and calculating, kept him pinned to the marble floor I had paid for with years of my own labor. His breathing grew erratic. His bloodshot eyes desperately searched the crowd for an exit, but all the doors were closed, and I held the only key. The game of appearances was over. The illusion had shattered into 1,000 pieces over the head table. Now the debt collection began, and I always collected every last cent. Mayor Miller didn't wait for Richard to articulate a single word of defense. His face, which minutes earlier had radiated the lazy complacency of a man used to being flattered, was now a mask of deep, undisguised disgust. He turned to his wife, offered his arm with almost military stiffness, and without sparing another glance at my son-in-law, began to walk toward the main exit of the grand hall. The mayor's wife didn't even grab the silk shawl she had left over the back of her chair. She just clung to her husband's arm, keeping her chin high, fleeing the epicenter of humiliation, as if the Valdez family's failure were a contagious disease. The 3 Chicago investors weren't far behind. The gray-haired man, the one who had spoken so harshly moments before, buttoned his gray suit jacket with a deliberate, almost insulting slowness. His hawk-like eyes scanned the head table, resting for a second on the floral arrangements, and then on Richard's pale, sweaty face. "Good luck with the bank, Valdez," the investor murmured, in a neutral tone that sliced through the cold air of the room. "And don't bother calling our offices. Our numbers no longer exist for you." That simple, direct sentence was the kill shot. The exodus began. 200 members of high society, those who had come to drink free champagne and witness the supposed financial coronation of Vance Construction, stood up in unison. The sound of heavy mahogany chairs scraping against polished marble was deafening, an industrial cacophony that completely drowned out the high-pitched sobs beginning to tear from my daughter's throat. Women frantically grabbed their designer bags, whispering to each other loudly enough for the echo to carry their words of contempt all the way to the head table. Men avoided eye contact with Richard, quickening their pace toward the massive glass lobby, subtly shoving each other to be the first to abandon the sinking ship. Chloe reacted with the blind instinct of a cornered animal. She jumped out of her chair, almost tripping over the heavy emerald fabric of her dress, and ran after the lead investor's wife. "Amelia, please wait," Chloe begged, stretching out her ring-covered hand to try and grab the sleeve of the woman's coat. "I swear it's a misunderstanding. Let me buy you coffee tomorrow and I'll explain everything." The woman named Amelia stopped dead. She yanked her arm away with a sharp movement and glared at my daughter. "Don't touch me, Chloe," the woman said, her voice dripping with refined, icy venom. "And don't call me tomorrow. I find people who pretend to be what they aren't absolutely unbearable." What an embarrassment. Do us all a favor and don't set foot in the club again. Chloe stood petrified in the middle of the empty dance floor, her hands still reaching out in the air, watching as the wrought iron gates of the estate swung wide open, spitting her guests out into the gravel parking lot. Nobody wanted to catch the stench of bankruptcy. Nobody looked at her with pity. In the artificial world she had chosen to inhabit, sudden poverty was the only sin with no possible redemption. From my metal folding chair in the furthest, darkest corner of the room, I watched the disintegration of her papier-mâché empire. I didn't lift a finger. I kept both hands wrapped around my porcelain cup, feeling the heat of the chamomile tea seep through my tired knuckles. Beside me, the young waiter in white gloves stood at attention, his back straight and his hands clasped behind his waist, watching the scene with the quiet respect of someone who knows they are witnessing pure justice. Through the glass of the swinging kitchen doors, I could make out the heavy figure of Marcus, the chef, peeking out with a fierce, satisfied smile under his thick mustache. In less than 15 minutes, The hall of the Ashwood estate was completely emptied of important people. The silence that settled over the place was overwhelming, interrupted only by the deep hum of the central air conditioning and the occasional clink of melting ice cubes in abandoned crystal glasses on the tables. The place looked like the stage of a monumental theater production, right after the audience has left the auditorium demanding a refund. Richard was no longer standing. His knees, unable to support the weight of his own ruin, had completely given out. He was sprawled on the floor, sitting on the cold marble, his back resting against the center leg of table number 1. He had ripped off his silk tie and thrown it aside. His face was buried in his palms and his shoulders shook with violent spasms, letting out a hoarse, pathetic wail that bounced off the bare walls. All his arrogance, all his calculated cruelty had been reduced to a puddle of sweat and tears under a table he couldn't pay for. Chloe walked slowly back toward the head of the table. Her steps were erratic, as if she had suddenly forgotten how to walk in heels. She collapsed into the empty chair the mayor had occupied moments before. Her makeup had run completely, forming 2 dark, ashen streaks down her cheeks, making her look like a ghost that had aged overnight. She rested her elbows on the imported linen tablecloth she had demanded exclusive rights to, and buried her face in her arms, sobbing openly. Slowly, I set my porcelain cup down on the small, round table. I stood up. My gray wool coat was still folded over the back of the metal chair. I didn't put it on. I grabbed my black purse, hung it firmly over my forearm, and began to walk toward the center of the hall. My low-heeled shoes made a rhythmic, dry, constant sound against the marble. Tap, tap, tap. Every step was another nail in the coffin of their illusions. I walked past the abandoned tables, brushing my fingertips against the backs of the empty chairs, breathing in the cold, clean air of my own house. I stopped 6 feet from the head table. I looked at Richard, curled up on the floor like a trampled worm, and then at Chloe, who looked up when she heard my footsteps. Her bloodshot eyes stared at me with a mix of terror and a stupid kind of hope, as if she believed that now that the audience was gone, I would go back to being the submissive mother, ready to sweep up the debris of her disaster. "Mom," Chloe whispered, reaching a trembling hand out toward me. "They're gone. You destroyed us. Are you happy? Are you satisfied with your revenge? You took everything from us in 20 minutes. I didn't raise my voice. There was no need. The silence of the hall was my best amplifier. "I didn't take anything from you, Chloe," I replied with an icy calm that seemed to make her shrink in her seat. "I just turned on the light. You haven't had anything for years. You built a castle on water and tried to use my bones as the foundation so it wouldn't sink. You had 45 years to learn to love me, to respect me. Today, you learned to fear me. It's a poor substitute, I know, but it's the only feeling you have left to offer me, and I accept it." Richard lifted his head from the floor. His face was red, swollen, deformed by absolute panic. "Eleanor, the bank," he babbled, his voice broken, dragging himself slightly on his knees toward where I stood. "If I don't deposit the advance for the municipal contract by Tuesday, they'll execute the mortgage. They're going to take the house. They're going to seize the company cars. I'll be out on the street. Please, you have the money. Oakmont Holdings has liquidity. Loan it to me against the mortgage. I'll sign whatever you want. I'll give you 50% of the construction company." I felt a physical revulsion so strong I had to clench my jaw to keep from spitting on the floor. "Your construction company isn't worth the weight of the ink you use to print your business cards, Richard," I declared, looking down at him with absolute coldness. "I don't want your paper company. I don't want your empty promises. And I am not giving you a single cent of my wealth to save the mansion you bought to humiliate others. First thing tomorrow morning, you will call your lawyers and declare bankruptcy. It is the only decent way out you have left. And if you try to hide a single asset, I will personally make sure my lawyers audit every account in your name." Before Richard could let out another howl of despair, I heard hurried footsteps approaching from the left side of the hall. I turned my head. It was David and Sarah. My grandson walked with a tense jaw, his eyes wide, processing the magnitude of the crater that had just opened up beneath his family. Sarah was a step behind, clutching little Leo tightly to her chest. The baby, exhausted by the tension in the room, had finally fallen asleep, oblivious to the collapse of the world around him. David ignored his mother, who was crying on the table, and his father, who was still kneeling on the floor. He walked straight up to me. There was no anger toward me in his face. There was a delayed understanding, a painful clarity that made him look 10 years older all of a sudden. "Grandma," David said, his voice deep and raspy, "I heard what you said to the mayor. I heard the manager. This whole time, the estate, the company, it was all yours. Dad lied to all of us." I nodded slowly, keeping my eyes locked on my grandsons. "Your grandfather and I built it with our own hands, David, brick by brick, and I kept it a secret to protect it from the very people who lied to you today." Sarah sobbed softly, squeezing the baby. The terror in her eyes was obvious, the primal terror of a mother seeing the roof over her child's head threatened. "Mrs. Eleanor, the bridge loan," Sarah whispered, her lips trembling. "Richard made us sign as guarantors 3 months ago. We put our house up as collateral for the construction company. If they go bankrupt, the bank will take our house, too. Leo will be homeless." David lowered his head, ashamed to his core for having been so naive, for having blindly trusted the expensive suit and empty words of his father. I reached out and took my grandson's face, lifting his chin firmly to force him to look at me. My touch was rough, full of old calluses, but it was loaded with a fierce, protective love I would never offer Chloe. "Listen to me closely, boy," I said, softening my voice just for him. "The debts of arrogance are not inherited by the innocent. Your only crime was being a good son to a man who didn't deserve it. Tomorrow at 9 in the morning, I want you in Sylvia's office. My lawyers are already drafting the paperwork. Oakmont Holdings is going to buy your debt directly from the bank. I will own your mortgage, and in that exact moment, I will sign a total forgiveness of the debt in Leo's name. Your house is safe. Nobody is going to touch my great-grandson's roof." Sarah let out a choked gasp of relief. Her knees buckled and she had to lean on her husband's shoulder. David looked at me with tears in his eyes, and for the first time all afternoon, I saw in him the same open honesty Arthur had when he was young. "I don't know how to repay you for this, Grandma. I'll work my whole life if I have to." "You already paid me, David," I replied, pulling my hand away from his face. "You'll pay me by breaking the cycle. Starting today, you cut all financial ties with your father. You don't sign a single paper for him. You don't lend him a single dollar. You don't open the door if he comes looking to hide from his creditors. If you want to save your family, you let him sink alone with his. Do you understand me?" David glanced sideways at Richard, who was still on the floor, sobbing, unable to even defend himself against the order I had just given. My grandson nodded firmly, squared his shoulders, and wrapped a protective arm around Sarah. "I understand you, Grandma, perfectly." I nodded, satisfied. I turned around, turning my back on the head table, my daughter and my son-in-law, and began to walk toward the staff exit toward my offices. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't look back. I left them there alone in the middle of their empty hall, surrounded by dead flowers and cold food swallowing the poison they had cooked themselves. Autumn brought cold winds that swept the dry leaves from the ash trees in the estate's gardens. And with that same brutality, it swept away the remains of Vance construction. The collapse was rapid, clinical, and absolutely public. 6 months after the baptism, I was sitting in the small sewing room of my own house, the real one, a modest but impeccable home in the quiet northern suburbs of the city. Outside, a light rain was falling, but the inside of my room smelled of cotton thread, mild soap, and the freshly brewed coffee Sylvia Monroe had just poured us. Sylvia came by on the first Tuesday of every month to hand me the financial report for Oakmont Holdings. We had developed a quiet, efficient routine. She would open her leather briefcase on my cutting table, show me the glowing numbers of the operating agency, and then, with that relentless neutrality that characterized her, update me on the fate of my former tormentors. "The liquidation process finished yesterday, Mrs. Eleanor," Sylvia said, taking a sip from her ceramic mug while reviewing a printed folio. "The bank foreclosed on the Valdez house and the golf club. They auctioned the property behind closed doors to cover the construction company's labor liabilities. They also repossessed the two luxury SUVs and froze their personal bank accounts. There is absolutely nothing left. I didn't stop sewing. In my hands, I held a small navy blue cotton onesie I was making for Leo's first birthday. The needle went in and out of the fabric with hypnotic precision. "Where are they living?" I asked, without looking up from the seam, keeping my voice in a purely informational tone, stripped of any residual emotion. Sylvia turned a page in her report, adjusting her glasses. "They rented a two-bedroom apartment in the industrial zone near where you and Mr. Arthur had your first food stand." Ironically, Richard got a job as a low-level technical draftsman at an architecture firm owned by one of the men he used to humiliate at the club. He makes minimum wage. I'm told he's aged 10 years overnight. He doesn't raise his voice anymore. He doesn't look anyone in the eye. I pulled the thread securing a wooden button on the chest of the onesie. "And Chloe—" Sylvia paused briefly. It was the only time I noticed a slight trace of discomfort in her professional posture. "Chloe doesn't leave the apartment. She had her cell phone plan canceled because she couldn't stand her former friends blocking her on social media. The few times she's been seen, it's been at the discount supermarket in the neighborhood, walking fast, hiding her face under old sunglasses so no one recognizes her. She had to sell all her designer rings, piece by piece at pawn shops downtown, just to pay the security deposit on the rental. She has become completely invisible." I snipped the excess thread with my silver scissors. The symmetry of the punishment was so perfect, it almost seemed designed by a watchmaker. For her entire life, Chloe had treated me like a ghost, a shameful presence that needed to be confined to dark corners so as not to ruin the aesthetic of her greatness. And now, the entire universe had returned the favor with chilling exactness. She was the one hiding. She was the one keeping her head down. She was the invisible woman. Crushed by the weight of the very same social disdain she had used as a weapon against me. "Justice doesn't make noise, Sylvia," I murmured, carefully folding the blue onesie and placing it on the table. "It just puts things back in the place where they always belonged. Thank you for the report. The estate's numbers look excellent this month." Sylvia smiled, closed her briefcase, and stood up. "Everything is running perfectly, Mrs. Eleanor. By the way, Marcus asked me to remind you that the new wood-fired oven has been installed in the main kitchen. He's curing it this afternoon." A genuine, warm, deep smile lit up my face. "Tell Marcus I will be there on Sunday at exactly 1 o'clock. Do not let them book any commercial events for that day. The estate is ours this weekend." That Sunday, the sun shone high and bright over the century-old trees of the Ashwood estate. There were no pretentious tents in the gardens, no string quartets playing boring melodies, no politicians sweating falsehood inside tight suits. The massive swinging doors of the kitchen were wide open, letting out the thick, honest, overwhelmingly delicious smell of short ribs slow cooking in the new wood-fired oven. It was the smell of true abundance, the smell of honest work that Arthur and I knew so well. In the exact center of the grand main hall, right where the table of lies and humiliation had stood months ago, there was now a single rectangular, rustic wooden table, with no imported linen tablecloths to hide its natural grain. I sat at the head. I was wearing my gray dress, the same one I had made with my own hands, perfectly pressed and clean. To my right was David, laughing loudly with his shirt sleeves rolled up, pouring red wine into thick glass tumblers. To my left, Sarah sliced pieces of freshly baked country bread, her face relaxed, freed from the financial terror that had threatened her home. And running around the table with quick, clumsy steps was little Leo, dressed in the comfortable blue cotton onesie I had sewn for him. No scratchy lace, no tight buttons, free to get his hands dirty. Marcus came out of the kitchen carrying a massive, steaming clay platter, wiping the sweat from his forehead with a clean white towel. He placed it in the center of the table with a dull, satisfying thud. "Let's eat, family," the chef announced, his voice echoing in the empty hall, full of joy and without a single drop of subservience. He took off his apron and sat down next to David, like the family member he had always truly been. I looked around. The massive hall embraced us with its luminous vastness. There were no photographers, no important people faking smiles, no appearances to keep up. I reached out my right hand and rested my open palm on the rough, solid surface of the wooden table. I felt the natural cracks, the unbreakable firmness of the material supporting the weight of our food. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the aroma of the roast and the echo of my great-grandson's laughter, knowing with absolute certainty that for the first time in many years, my house was completely clean.